This video will briefly explore the Mongol occupation of China from 1264 to 1368 Common Era. This period was known as the Yuan dynasty and became one of the many dynasties that ruled the area that is now China. The origins of the Yuan dynasty date back to the great Genghis Khan and his conquest over much of Asia during the 13th century. Through his superb military tactics and well-disciplined armies, Genghis created the largest empire the world had ever known, bigger than Alexander's Greece and Caesar's Rome. He effectively conquered most of this whole area. It starts in Russia, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, northern Pakistan, most of China, and northern Mongolia. This became known as Genghis's empire. After Genghis's death in 1227, his empire was split among his 4 sons. Each son ruled a political entity called a khanate. The khanate of Shagati controlled Central Asia. It was a largely nomadic and pastoral area. The khanate of Kapechak became known as the Golden Horde and ruled what is now Russia. The khanate of Il-Khanate ruled Persia, and what is now China and Mongolia fell under the tutelage of what became known as the Great Khanate. This is the area that Kublai Khan would eventually rule. And this is what we'll talk about for most of the video. Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan, one of his grandsons, and was chosen to be the Khan in 1260 and rule over the Great Khanate. He assumed effective control over the Mongolian occupation of China. After moving the capital of his new empire to Beijing in 1264, he began to assimilate into the existing Chinese culture. This means that rather than come into the country and disband the political institutions and civil service offices that ruled the country, Kublai Khan actually saw that they were highly effective and then decided to use them as his own. In becoming more like the Chinese, Khan did a lot of things that were very similar to the Chinese people before. For example, he accepted the dynastic title the Yuan, accepted the Chinese custom of hereditary succession, and built the Grand Canal, illustrated by this arrow here. It's the largest artificial canal in the world, and it basically brought goods and services up waterways from the fertile plains of central China to the northern, more remote areas at the time. The Grand Canal still exists today and was designated a UNESCO Heritage Site in 2014. The Yuan dynasty also adopted Chinese political institutions, especially when it meant more revenue. After Chinese officials effectively convinced the Mongols that more wealth was to be gained from levies rather than looting, the Mongols adapted Chinese taxation systems. Khan also retained the existing civil administration procedures. Rather than have one guy rule over an entire country, he had kind of something, like a head honcho, a second in command who could control and see over a bunch of other rulers who ruled throughout the provinces. This became known as the moving secretariats, or essentially kind of like province leaders or different people, delegated responsibility, something similar to kind of a federal system of government. The Mongols and the Chinese didn't always get along, however. Remember, the Mongols were really occupiers in a foreign land. Much to the consternation of the Chinese officials, the Mongols opened up China to the outside world. Persian and Arab traders ventured into China, eager to make a profit and explore the hitherto unknown land. Abu Battah, a Moroccan who was an explorer, wrote of the vast wealth. He traveled to the Yuan dynasty and told everybody back home about it, and even a young Venetian explorer, who you know as Marco Polo, caught the attention of the world when he traveled, supposedly met with Kublai Khan, and then wrote of all of the riches in his famous book, A Description of the World, published in 1300. China was always prosperous, but it was always an isolated empire, and it would be changed forever. In addition to explorers coming and visiting, Christianity was brought to the Yuan dynasty from Europe. Islam was brought from North Africa. Buddhism took a higher toll in China, especially Tibetan Buddhism. And Confucianism, the existing philosophy and doctrine of China, began to spread and grow. The Mongols changed China, that goes without saying, but to conclude, there still retained a uniquely Chinese element that remained intact in the south and was untouched by Mongol influence. This sect maintained its prior history, culture, language, and customs, and it would continue to shape China and its future. Now, despite the colossal size of the Yuan dynasty, it lasted for less than 100 years. So, what happened? Well, effectively, the Khanates began competing with one another. Religion, culture, history, and distance now separated what was once Genghis Khan's mighty empire. Corruption began to exist in the provinces. There was a series of droughts, rebellions, unhappy peasants, and what seems to be a recurring trend in history. Maybe the Yuan dynasty and the Mongols and Kublai Khan, maybe they just were too big for their own good. Similar to Alexander's Greece, similar to Rome, similar to what we'll study in the Arab rising in its civilization. Maybe they just get too big for their own good. This concludes the video. Good work.